On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
And I think for me, I have found that this connection to a higher power, to believing in something bigger than myself, I find more in service. I find it in nature. I have reconnected with a church now, but I really do believe that there is this grace that's running through the world. There is something bigger than us. I think we each have a calling, and my faith is really oriented around that, in a spirituality, in a connection with purpose, in a connection of people who are drawn to that work, and now a commitment to helping people find their connection to what it is, to putting them on their path, and hopefully to finding their calling.
Kathy Izard is the author of The 100-Story Home, a memoir about finding faith in ourselves and something bigger. The memoir tells the story of how Kathy listened to a whisper urging her to house the homeless. She launched Homeless to Homes, a housing-first proof of concept, and led a capital campaign to build More Place, the first permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless in Charlotte. She has worked on numerous civic projects, including leading fundraising efforts for HopeWay, the first nonprofit residential mental health treatment center in the Charlotte region. Before these efforts, Kathy was a graphic designer and soup kitchen volunteer. She is a member of the Women's Impact Fund and serves on the board of directors of the Charlotte Urban Ministry Center, More Place, HopeWay, and the Crossnore School for foster children. In this episode, we explore family, faith, privilege, the importance of home, and a search for meaning and purpose that continues. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Kathy, welcome to On Life and Meaning.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the publication of The 100-Story Home.
Thanks so much.
In fact, the book is a republication, isn't it?
It is. I originally self-published the book in 2016, and then it was picked up last year, summer of 2017, by a division of HarperCollins.
The book is beautiful, wonderfully written.
Thank you.
You are giving interviews about it on television and radio, on podcasts. You're giving speeches and receiving awards and recognition. How does it feel?
A little surreal and overwhelming and completely unexpected. I spent 6 years writing that book in my kitchen, and over the course of those 6 years, I stopped and I started a million times. I put it away many times thinking, A, who is ever going to read this, and B, why am I writing it? And so to have the response that I've had to it has been really, really amazing.
What is the story that the 100-Story Home tells?
The 100-Story Home tells the story not only of my work with homelessness, but also in finding my own way home. And it was that work in meeting the homeless people that we were dealing with, and also finding a career that was much more purposeful than I feel the one I was leading. I was a graphic designer. I was a mother of 4. But somehow I knew that wasn't all I was supposed to be doing. I just wasn't sure how to find my way to what it was I was supposed to be doing. And so this book is about that, and hopefully encouraging readers to find what's calling them.
Kathy, what are the key events of the story?
I think the key events of the story start first with a moment that I had in 2007 when I met a formerly homeless author, Denver Moore, and I was taking him down to the Urban Ministry Center, which is where I've been a volunteer once a month for years, almost a decade. And I was showing Denver all that we were doing down there and honestly thinking we were doing a really great job. I was very proud of it. It's an amazing organization in Charlotte. It still is. It has a 25-year history. But Denver really made me see that day that serving soup was not enough, that what homeless people really need were homes. And I think the first story that really started the whole book, he looked at me and said, "Where are the beds? And finally, what are you going to do about it?" And it was a moment that I couldn't walk away from. And so that's the beginning of all of the stories that come after. It also tells stories of my own childhood, of why I would be drawn to this work. My childhood included a mother who was bipolar, living with a bipolar diagnosis. I had a very happy, loving home, great-grandparents and father, but that was really challenging and was not something I really explored or talked about. I tried to just forget it. But somehow seeing the women that we were dealing with on the streets, watching them homeless at night, wondering what would have happened to my mother had my father not been an attorney and allowed the health and care and all the things that my family could provide for my mother until she was well. It really, I think that's what drew me to the work. And I really didn't understand that till I was in my 40s. And probably the third story that it tells is doing something about it, of building the beds, of looking for change and finding, I don't think I came through it from a social justice perspective in the beginning, but it's what it became, is that every person deserves a home. There's a human dignity in housing. And I think that's probably one of the final stories that we explore.
Kathy, your book does tell many stories that you just referenced. As I read it, it tells the story of your own family and how that informed your choices, a search for meaning and purpose in your life, the encounter with Denver Moore that led you to take on a very improbable task, the building of Moore Place, the first permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless in Charlotte, and the personal yearnings that you have reconciled. Is there a particular story among those that is most meaningful to you?
I tell a lot of stories in the book. My favorite story is, in order to build that building, we raised $10 million in Charlotte, which is completely improbable during a recession. And that money came to us from gifts of children who did a lemonade stand, who sent us $105, to random checks for $100 to $1 million gifts. But while we were raising that money, I started to receive these notes in the mail, these cards. And the first one I received, I opened it up at work. It was very unexpected. It's just a Hallmark card and kind of in a pink envelope. And I opened it up and $8 fell out, 5 and 3 ones. And the note was not signed. It just said, "May God bless and multiply this small amount." And that was it. And I had no idea who had sent this, but I just couldn't believe that someone had sent apparently their last dollars to us to help raise this money. And 2 weeks later, another one. Different amount, same type of message about God blessing and this small amount. And they kept coming week after week, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, but they kept coming. And I had no idea who this was. And it wasn't until Moore Place was built several years later and we were moving in our first tenants that we realized that the person who'd been sending me that money all this time was a woman named Frances Haley. And her son, Dale, had been homeless on the streets of Charlotte for years. And he was a favorite down at the Urban Ministry Center. We couldn't wait to house him. And we did, and we realized through that Dale had a mom who loved him, but didn't know how to find him in his homelessness. He was living in a very unusual situation. And she didn't know how to help her son, but she thought by sending those cards and letters that she might be able to help someone's son. And it turns out in this whole story that the woman who was sending that was Dale's mom, and her prayers and her cards and her dollars did matter because they did end up housing her son. And I think that is so remarkable on so many levels, because if I tried to make that up in a novel, someone would tell me that was completely unbelievable. And I think the other thing that was so remarkable about that story is my mother has this Hallmark obsession. She writes cards all the time, and I never really understood why she did that until Mrs. Haley in my life showed me how important one message, one note of encouragement is, and to realize that this woman was really so much like my mom with this ministry of cards and touch, and it's the way they create community in their world, and made it so much more valuable and special to me what my mother was doing.
Kathy, I'd like to spend our time less on what happens in the book, so that way people read it.
Yes, I hope they read it too. Thank you.
And more on the themes that arise in the book. And there are many themes: family, faith, privilege, hearing a call, persistence, the writing of the book itself. I'd like to begin with exploring the theme of family. There is your family of origin, your mom and dad and sisters. How would you describe the household you grew up in?
I actually thought I had a really happy, wonderful childhood. It really wasn't, because of my mother's mental illness, we chose not to talk about it. There's a chapter in the book called No Casseroles for Crazy. And the idea that, if someone has cancer, a community will wrap around that family. But with mental illness, it's something we hide. And I certainly hid that not only as a child growing up in that home, but later in life. I never talked about the fact that I'd experienced this. So I really viewed my life and my childhood as pretty great and pretty perfect despite that. And it really shocked me when this new version came out, and you can file a book under certain categories. And my new publisher chose one of the categories was under dysfunctional families. And I was really kind of shocked. Like, really? I had a dysfunctional family? I don't know. And I think that's true for all of us. What we know growing up, our childhood or our families, it's what we know. And so I think we think it's normal, whatever the circumstances are. So certainly my house was less normal than others. It was more functional than some. So I really view my life pretty idyllic. I had great family. I had great friends. I had incredible role models. I view my life as having a happy childhood.
You grew up in West Texas.
I did, in West Texas, in El Paso. That's kind of the point in Texas, the point where it almost falls off into New Mexico or Mexico. It's a very different place to grow up in the desert.
And the landscape was particularly interesting because you speak about borders in the book, don't you?
And again, that's not something I really contemplated until I was writing. And I was realizing that this community that I'd grown up with very stark haves and have-nots. El Paso is built in a U shape around the Franklin Mountains. And we are separated by Juarez, Mexico, in some places only by the Rio Grande River, which is not grand at all. In some places, it's 20 feet wide. And so we were constantly growing up, as you would drive down Interstate 10, you look to your right and you see these shacks with no electricity, no running water, dirt roads. And if you look to your left on this very same highway, you see the University of Texas El Paso, this beacon of education and higher learning and promise. And I think it really embedded in me this sense of 10 feet away. If you were born 10 feet away, it made all the difference in the world. Whereas 10 feet on the other side was this incredible life of privilege, and understanding the Mexican and the American experience was something that formed in me in a way that I didn't understand till I was an adult.
And you became sensitive to borders and divisions later in life, didn't you?
I did, and I think there's so many fine lines in our world, whether it's privilege and not privilege, whether it's this immigration issue. I think the fine line between sanity and madness, too. Somerset Maugham wrote a book, The Razor's Edge, talking about this very fine line between genius and madness. So as I was writing this book, I did have a note on the side about these contrasts between borders, the housed, the not housed. In Charlotte, the African-American experience versus a white experience. In my own life, all the different border issues that are raised. Yes, I think they run throughout our lives in many ways.
Kathy, a motto that you grew up with is do good, love well. What does do good, love well mean to you?
It takes me back to my childhood, to where my father I was one of 3 daughters. And in a time when maybe women were raised more to get married and have children, my father thought that was important. But he never really wanted to have that conversation with me about who I was going to get married to or how many kids I was going to have. What he wanted to know was what I was going to do in this world and how was I going to leave the world a better place. Those were the conversations my father had. And he really believed in a life of service. While he became a lawyer, he went to divinity school, and I think there was a piece of him that was still a minister in some way. And so this servant leadership was embedded into each of us, myself and my two sisters. And so that's where the do good comes from. And then his mother, my grandmother, Gigi for Grandmother Green, because my maiden name was Green. But Gigi had a really interesting experience where she was orphaned young, and she was brought into a family of incredible wealth. She was not actually part of the family. One of the people who worked for this wealthy family had adopted her, and so she was not part of that home really. She was not quite servant, yet not quite family, and was moved around all the time through these different estates that they lived in. And she'd never really had a family. So her family that she created with her 2 sons and my grandfather, and then finally her 5 granddaughters, just meant the world to her. And she never let us forget that the family was the most important thing, that the people around you loving well was the most important thing, above career, above money, above privilege, above status, about anything that you might think in your world, that loving each other was really the most important thing. So that comes together in this do good, love well, that I think really formed myself and my sisters.
As you reflect on your own life, what is the more challenging of the two, doing good or loving well?
Oh, for me, loving well all day long. I think this do good, you have this idea of service, and then I must, and you must do these things. But the loving well sometimes I think is the hardest point for me. Maybe because my childhood was in some ways I didn't have the motherhood, the ideal motherhood. And so motherhood for me was challenging, of really trying to get that right, of trying to do it better. And sometimes I think I'm much more cold and prickly than I would like to be warm and fuzzy and loving like my grandmother. So for me, the loving well is something I really have to think about. I even have a bracelet that I wear on my arm that says love well, to remind me some mornings to say family first, people first. Some of the obligations in the outside world can wait as you remember your family and the people you love most.
Kathy, there is your family of origin, but also your current family, your husband, Charlie, your 4 daughters.
Yes.
Is there anything you didn't say in the book about the role they played that you wished you had said?
I wish that I should have given a whole chapter to my husband in particular about, how do you have that conversation when I basically came home one night and said, okay, this 25-year career that I've had, I think I'm going to punt that and I'm going to go house homeless people. And by the way, that income that I've been making, I think I'm going to give that up too. So it started with this tiny whisper that I was going to do this crazy thing, and I hadn't said it out loud. And the first time I said it out loud was to my husband, Charlie. And if he had looked at me and said, well, you're not qualified to do that. You're crazy. What are you doing? I think I probably would have said, you're right, and maybe rolled over and gone to sleep that night, and none of this would have happened. Not changing my career, not building more place, not writing this book. None of that would have happened. It starts with a partner in your life that, even if you're feeling crazy about what you're doing, can kind of walk with you in that insanity and say, well, it's okay. I believe that you should be doing this. And so that should be a whole chapter, I think, about that partnership of having someone in your life who believes in what you're doing and encourages your goals, and how that makes a difference not only for you and your family, but for others. And then I think my daughters were incredibly understanding and supportive, as I was obsessed with this idea of this almost Don Quixote task. And sometimes I would forget their carpools, or I would forget what I was supposed to be doing as a mom. And I think they were incredibly generous and understanding, and allowing me to pursue my dreams at the same time as they were growing up and finding their own.
Kathy, there are also your colleagues and neighbors at the Urban Ministry Center and the residents of Moore Place, a different type of family. Is family and home the same thing or something different?
Wow, that's a really interesting question, Mark. I think, as you said, there's family of origin, then there's the family that we create, then there's the friends who become our family. And I think home is a place not only that you make with that family, like my family of Charlie and the girls, but I do think it's extended. I think Charlotte is our home, unlike my address. And while El Paso was my home for so long, I really do believe that there's so many places in Charlotte that feel like my home. The Urban Ministry Center, there's a certain park I go to every day that feels like my home. I think we create places and spaces with the people we love, and all of that becomes our home.
You spent many a day with homeless people who yearn for a home. Is the yearning even deeper for them for family?
It's interesting how people who are experiencing homelessness create community and connection with each other, and they create their family, their street family. And I think that is so basic human want, is to belong to someone, to belong to something. There's people who have, their real name might be Sam, but his street name is Dancing Bear, and his street family knows him in that way. And I think something that we underestimated is when we took someone from the street, we housed people directly from street to home, and we put them in this apartment thinking that was going to be their home and not realizing we had separated them from the family that they'd created. And there was a sense of shame and guilt that they couldn't bring them with them to their apartment. So new families had to be created. A lot of folks had been disconnected from their families of origin, and being housed allowed them to overcome the sense of guilt and shame that had happened in their life and allowed them to reconnect with their family of origin. In Moore Place, we now have people who've reconnected and babysit their grandchildren in Moore Place. There's no children who live in Moore Place, but families can visit. They can have their home in their place. And I think it gives you a real sense of identity again, to just have that front door that you walk in and out of every day, and it really restores a dignity that you have your own 366 square feet, which is all it is in a Moore Place apartment. But that is such a sacred space for people who've lost everything and refind it again.
Kathy, let's talk about faith. You describe the book as a bridge toward faith. You use the language of faith throughout the book, but you also talk about an arm's length relationship you have with religion.
Yes.
When you speak of faith, what is the faith that you are speaking about?
Oh, you ask such deep questions, Mark. I started in a place where I was raised in a Presbyterian family, going to church all the time, and I really pulled away from what I call organized religion, because I didn't feel it was working for me. I've never found God in a pew. I just wasn't feeling it. And so I just thought, well, maybe I'm one of those people where religion doesn't apply to me. It certainly applied to my parents and to other people I knew. But through this work, I felt a restlessness to fill a hole. And I think I've realized over time that hole had to do with believing in something bigger than myself. I think that faith is different for every person. I think the relationship with a higher power is different for every person. Some people find that in an organized way, very structured in an Episcopalian or a Catholic way, or Judaism. And I think for me, I have found that this connection to a higher power, to believing in something bigger than myself, I find more in service. I find it in nature. I have reconnected with a church now, but I really do believe that there is this grace that's running through the world. There is something bigger than us. I think we each have a calling, and my faith is really oriented around that, in a spirituality, in a connection with purpose, and a connection of people who are drawn to that work. And now a commitment to helping people find their connection to what it is, to putting them on their path, and hopefully to finding their calling.
That faith in higher purpose, in service, in meaning, isn't necessarily one in a traditional view of God, is it?
Not for me. I don't have a lot of theology. If you want to ask me questions about the Bible, I will really not be able to win that quiz show. I do not have a lot of traditional theology. I've been doing exploration and a lot of reading. I've found a lot of connection with Barbara Brown Taylor, who writes a lot about leaving church. One of her books is Altars in the World, Walking in the Dark. And those two books have really resonated with me about the way she describes faith and God. And she is an ordained minister and has left church and found different ways. So it's made me feel better about the way that I understand spirituality and understand the world, because if she can go to divinity school and come to a same understanding that I can connect with, it makes me feel a little bit better about the feeling of spirituality and theology that I have found.
You do write the book in a way where the use of the word faith is open-ended and the reader infuses their own meaning into it.
That was very intentional. I think there's a lot of polarism in the world, from people who believe in nothing to people who are certain in what they believe, and then sometimes not a lot in between. And if you're somehow trying to find your way down that path, people who are certain in their theology are difficult to hear or listen to. And I certainly have found that in my own life, that someone who was really certain in their Christianity, I found it hard to really understand that type of certainty, because I find interesting and resonate with different types of faith and not one theology. So I tried to write the book in a very open way. I tried to be honest about my experience and what happened to me, and hope that people would start rethinking what it is they think about their own faith. What has it been around their journey that either made them leave church or makes them want to reconnect? And whether it is church as a building, or faith in the world, or faith in action, or faith in service, help them be open to exploring that, to find exactly what is right for them. And I do believe in a God that comes to people in different ways. I do believe in a God who comes to someone in a Catholic church, or someone connects through Judaism or Hinduism, Buddhism. I think God is big enough to come to people in different ways. We certainly are all created differently with different intellects, and I think he comes to us in different ways. Or she, he or she.
One of the phrases you use is God instances. What are God instances, and how did they show up in your journey?
To me, God instance is coincidence that I'm convinced is not. Charlie laughs at me and says, "You think everything is a God instance now." And it goes back to that quote by Albert Einstein. There's two ways to live your life. One is if everything's a miracle, and one is if nothing is. I certainly, and I probably butchered that quote, it's something in that. But I certainly believe there are so many things that happen that you could say, well, that's a coincidence. But if you line them all up, I don't believe they can be. And so that was one thing in writing the story of the 100-story home. All of the, if you will, coincidences, once you string them together in these magical dominoes that had to line up for all of these stories to be true, which they are, I cannot take it as coincidence. There really has to be part of a greater plan, of some divine force in this universe that I do believe in now.
Do you think building More Place could have happened without the existence of a God, or God have anything to do with it?
It certainly couldn't have happened with just me doing it. That was part of the most difficult part of More Place. It was so big, and yet there were so many people helping and drawn to this work. And the way we met each other and came together was certainly so remarkable. If it was just me waking up every day trying to make it happen, no, I don't believe it would have.
Do you think an agnostic or an atheist could have gone about the work of funding More Place and had the same results?
Maybe. They would have to be a much more talented agnostic than I was, because Dale Mullinex, who's the executive director of the Urban Ministry Center, we were partners in this, and he is a minister. So whether I was an agnostic or not, Dale had the higher power working for us.
Kathy, let's talk about privilege. In the book, you talk about moments in which you had guilt and shame about your privilege. What were those moments?
There were so many along the way. I hadn't really realized my upbringing, how many advantages that you have from, just starting in a middle-class family, to knowing that college was a certainty in my life. It was never even a question that I would go to college, to the fact that I had a father who believed in women and what we could do. And then meeting so many people along the way, whether experiencing homelessness or colleagues who were doing this work who came from different backgrounds, just realizing that wasn't true for everyone. I had a certainty that I was going to eat every day. I had a certainty that I was going to be housed every day. I had a certainty that I would be able to have a profession where I had money to raise my own family. And I realized that is not a certainty for so many people. And I think going to the grocery store one day with one of our formerly homeless men, Jay, I learned a lot that day. I learned, one, Jay was schizophrenic. He had grown up in a home where seeing a psychiatrist or a therapist was not something that you did. And he talked about how his sister was hearing voices, and she told her mother that she was hearing voices, and she was sent to the state hospital. And Jay told me that when his sister got back, she was never right. So he said, I didn't tell my mother I was hearing voices too. I just started drinking. And it never occurred to me that, my mother never turned to the bottle when she was hearing voices. She turned to the Bible. Her story was very different. And she was able to have psychiatric intervention and therapy. Jay was not. And understanding just even from the basic idea of his mental health was very different from what happens in a family that has privilege. I think that really stood out for me that day.
But why have guilt or shame about it?
I think it's that same idea of being on the river and being born on one side or the other. Why was I so lucky to be born on the right side of El Paso, Texas, and not the wrong side of Juarez, Mexico? I don't know. I know some people maybe don't find it that way, but I think it's just something that impresses on my heart that gratitude, but also a sense of why me? Why was I lucky on the right instead of unlucky on the left? Why was I middle class and able to go on to do these things, and someone sitting in the dirt and no electricity with no chance or no choice? I can't explain it.
Yeah. Guilt and gratitude are very different things.
They are. And I think I feel both. I think I feel gratitude for the life I have. And still sometimes when I pass someone on the street and I see them holding a cardboard sign asking for help, I still have guilt, the fact that I'm in my car driving by.
Kathy, you set out to build More Place. You raised the money to build it. You set out to write a book. You wrote a book. You set out to become a public speaker. You are speaking in public.
Well, I never set out to be a public speaker. I will tell you that. That's been an unexpected part of this journey.
What qualities in you account for these achievements?
I don't actually know. I believe I have a persistence and a work ethic that were embedded from my father, watching him get up every day and practice the law and help people at the same time that in his home. It was very different than he expected, yet he got up every day and kept going, and he stayed with my mother in the hardest times, and he loved her through those times. And their love story and their work ethic and their commitment to others, even though their own lives were maybe not what they expected as they set out. Davidson College grad and a Queen's University grad, they were the brightest of the bright and expected only bright and shining stars in their future, and part of their life was very different than they expected. So I think witnessing that was very informative to me. I don't really know. I don't know that I can explain exactly what makes me wake up every morning wanting to do those things, to write a book or to raise money. But I think the example that my parents set and then my grandparents before them, I think informs what I do every day.
One of the things that comes through in reading your story and listening to you is promise and keeping promises. Can you speak more about that?
Again, I think I was raised by parents and grandparents where your word was everything and you did what you said. And my father was so ethical. There was no gray. He even going back to Davidson College, there was a time when I think you weren't allowed to drink at Davidson. And he ended up having to make a choice to turn in his own cousin on an honor violation. And he did. And I I just remember being so struck by that he was such a man of honor and ethics, and my grandfather was as well. There's no choice in our family. I think there's right and there's wrong, and there's not a lot of gray in between.
Kathy, I'm curious about the writing of the book. You write that it took 2 editors and 2 therapists to finish the book. Were you in actual therapy during the writing of the book?
I was. That is a true story, because as I wasn't planning to write anything about my mother and my childhood and myself. I was going to write this string of stories of how we raised this building, maybe more a history for Urban Ministry Center than an actual memoir. But I got the incredibly brilliant advice from an editor who said, no one is going to care about this story unless they care about you. You have to write about you. And she said, what I want to know is, who were you that day when some formerly homeless guy says to you, what are you going to do about it? Why did you listen? Why not just go home and go to sleep? Why not forget him? And I knew that had to do with my mom and the way I was raised and why I felt that so deeply. And when I started writing it and reflecting on it, there were things I hadn't thought about in decades. And it's that box that you have stored of memories that's been sealed with duct tape that you're really careful to keep sealed with duct tape because you don't want those ideas and memories leaking out. But they'd been leaking out for a long time anyway. And I'd never gone to therapy about it. I'd never said, hey, I would go to first grade and my mom was in the psychiatric hospital. I would come home in 7th grade and my mom had been left for another round at the hospital. I'd never talked about that. And when I started writing that, all kinds of feelings started coming up. So I did go into therapy for the first time at age 49, and I wish I'd done it at 29. And I would have been such a better mother and human being if I had, because I think we do need to reflect on our stories and we do need outside perspective. And I think there's nothing better than a good therapist. What did you learn about yourself? Well, I think I learned through the writing and through the therapy was that as a 6-year-old, there were things that I couldn't control that I was still holding on to at 49 and 50, and that you needed to let those go. And there was a part of me that felt my mother's condition was my fault, that if I had been a better child or a better daughter or something, that I somehow could have controlled her moods and kept her out of the hospital, or that somehow her illness was within my control. So I learned a lot about control. I learned a lot about what we take on ourselves. I learned a lot about black and white thinking, that there is some gray in between in what happens in the world and what we can control and what we can't. And really all you can control is your response to it and how things affect you. You can control the response, but not what happens in the world. So I learned so much through writing and through therapy. I'm not sure I'm ever done. I'm sure if something else massive happens in my life, I'll go back again. And I would encourage anyone listening that if you're struggling with something, maybe your spouse and your best friends aren't the best people to process it with, and you might go process it with someone who's trained. Kathy, you are the protagonist of the story. It or not. Any good editor will tell you that readers want to identify with a protagonist, find them likable and relatable. Were you sensitive about writing the story in a way and projecting yourself in a way in the story that readers would care about you? I was really sensitive for anyone reading it to think that either A, my life was perfect, B, that this was easy, C, that I was looking for recognition or hero status out of that. That's not why I was writing the book. That's why I didn't want to put myself in the book. And I tried to imagine who would read this. And I finally came down to the fact that I was writing this to my 44-year-old self, to a woman who was out there like me, who'd been raising her kids, who knew what her dreams for her kids were, but had forgotten what her own were. And she needed to read a book that says you can do it. Whatever it is you're doing, don't think you're unqualified. Don't think you necessarily have to go back to graduate school. Just put one foot in front of the other and try to move towards your dreams. And I started writing to her and tried to forget everything else about what someone might think if they read the book and just write to that person who needed to read that story. How do you think your 44-year-old self would have read that book? I hope that 44-year-old self would have said, yes, here's someone who's encouraging me to do what I can do. Yes, I hope my 44-year-old would say, finally, here's the book that's telling me what I need to hear.
Kathy, even the most accomplished people in life live with some degree of angst. The search for meaning and purpose continues for them. Is that true for you?
Every day I wonder, am I doing the right thing? Why am I putting myself in this position? I put myself out there in this crazy way in this book, and I'm standing up in front of people talking about it and putting myself out there. And some days I think, why am I doing this? And then I will meet someone who tells me their own story and shares with me what they're trying to do. And I'll go home and say, because of that, because I will not meet these people. I will not be able to encourage them. I will not be able to have this broader reach unless I'm willing to put myself on the line. And I have been rewarded so many times over the last year and a half, 2 years from this book of people who are brave enough to share their stories back about what they're doing, and it makes it all worth it.
There are moments in life when we are deeply wondering about meaning and purpose, and we think, if only we do something extraordinary, if only we receive recognition, if we only write the book, we will have it figured out. You are on the other side of having accomplished those things. Do you feel like you figured it out?
No, I feel like I'm still learning every day, and I don't feel like it was any accolades from the book that have given meaning to my life. I feel like it's the people that I've met through it. It's the experiences that we're walking through together. I think about my life 11 years ago. I feel like I was living very tight and small and afraid and not letting very many people into my world. And this book, it's not the book, but the work, first going to work for the Urban Ministry Center and expanding my circle to my colleagues, my coworkers, and other people drawn to the work. And then the people we were helping widened my circle again to different friends that I met that through we were housed. And then the people who were helping raise the money, that was a whole nother circle of friends that I never would have known. And then the circle of writers and other authors that I have now because I've written a book. And HopeWay is something we haven't talked about, but it was a whole nother circle that I worked on in mental illness in Charlotte. So people who were drawn to that work. So if I look at all of the people in the community that I've created through the book, through More Place, through HopeWay, through congregations that I'm speaking with, through social justice forums, my world has so much more meaning now because of those things, because I'm connecting to these communities of people who are working for good or asking deep questions or trying to help each other through service. That is the meaning that has brought richness to my life, not necessarily this book or any accolades that came because it's the community and connection that we've created that I've allowed myself to connect to that's made all the difference.
What do you feel capable of?
As my dad said, anything, really, anything. And I don't know that I believed it before. I really don't. But I don't know that it's just me. And that's the message that I really want to tell people. We are capable of so much more than we imagine. I never would have imagined writing a book 11 years ago. I never would have imagined raising $10 million. I never would have imagined standing up in front of 1,200 people and telling my story. And each one of those things has happened. And I didn't really believe myself capable. And now I do. There's still things that scare me every day. There's still things I don't want to do. But when I get afraid, I think, well, look, you didn't think you could do that, and you did. So just keep moving forward. And I hope people really take from this book, or if they're listening to whatever that wild dream is that you're thinking of, that you think that you can't do it, believe that you can. Take one baby step towards it, and then the next one. And you may look back in 1 year or 11 years and see that you did it and so much more.
Kathy, is there a whisper you are hearing now?
Oh, yes. They never stop. That's something about the universe. I will warn your listeners that once the universe realizes that you will listen and take action, they keep coming. So I thought my whisper of More Place was one and done. And then I worked on HopeWay with another group of people. And then this book, I'm drawn back to the Urban Ministry Center. We have a big old whisper going on there. And I have 2 other books I'm working on right now, which I didn't expect. One's a children's book that I'm very excited about. It's a children's version of the 100-Story Home. And then another nonfiction that's kind of the continuation of the 100-Story Home, something very unexpected in my life that happened afterwards. Trying to make understanding about that.
Kathy, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mark.
Kathy Izard is the author of The 100-Story Home, a memoir about finding faith in ourselves and something bigger. She earned a bachelor's degree in advertising from the University of Texas at Austin. And now, a personal word. I read The 100-Story Home over a week, at the end of long workdays, 20-minute sessions at a time, taking note of the words of praise from readers at the beginning of the book, of the copyright page, of the quotes at the beginning of chapters, of the chapter titles, of the reader's guide, of the book club questions and acknowledgments at the end of the book, and of every word of story in between, before falling off to sleep. I would wake up the next morning rechecking my bookmark. So much of the book impressed me, but one thing took hold of me. Here are a few things that impressed me. Kathy takes you into her life with such clarity that you are right there with her. She is a natural storyteller, or at least a writer who works hard to tell her story with ease. We are there at her birthday party when she is 6 years old and when her mom was first taken to a psychiatric ward. We are there when Kathy meets the man who would become her husband, standing beside a keg of beer. We are there as she ladles soup for homeless men and women. We are there when she hears a challenge to accomplish a task that seems completely improbable to do. We are there at the celebration of Moreplace when it becomes a home. I was impressed by her candor about religion. Kathy talks about her struggle with attending church. She avoids platitudes about faith. Her language about things greater than ourselves is honest and inclusive. She leaves it for the reader to find their own way. I was impressed by her kindness and vulnerability. I wondered as I read it whether she fashioned herself a likable and relatable protagonist, plucky and earnest, always deflecting praise, crediting everyone around her but herself. But the more I read for an off note, the more her voice remained consistent and true. I was impressed by so much more, by her search for meaning, by her commitment to social justice. But this is what took hold of me. Kathy has a chapter in her book called Failure is Not an Option. She talks about how she decided early on in life that if she couldn't succeed pretty quickly at something, she would throw in the towel. She generally felt there were 2 reasons to quit. If failure was likely because she didn't have the innate talent to measure up, or if it wasn't fun. She talks about playing tennis as a child every weekend with her dad, where from across the net, he would tell her, "Everything in life is about hard work, Kathy. Hard work and practice." She would win a citywide under-13 doubles competition, and her dad would say, "I told you, you can do anything, Kathy, really, anything." But Kathy quit tennis. She wasn't that good. It wasn't fun. She stopped playing with her dad. But the chapter goes on. Kathy jumps to a moment in her 40s when the phone rang and her dad informed her that he had cancer, an acute form of leukemia that would not give him much more time to live. Kathy hung up the phone, shattered. She talks about how he fought to survive, how he wore a t-shirt that proclaimed, "Never, never give up," how he persevered through his many treatments until he no longer could. Kathy ends the chapter reflecting on his passing, on the life lessons he could no longer share. She writes, "There was so much Dad had tried to tell me too that I could not hear. I wanted to listen now. I wanted to play tennis with him now. I was ready to play the game now. I wanted him to see that I could work hard at something and never, never give up." That is the story of the book for me. The love of family, the sharing of values, the taking on of tasks. Kathy's overriding trait is that she perseveres. She commits, and she does what she sets out to do. Hour after hour, day after day, she stays with it. She raised millions of dollars from hundreds of people, one contribution at a time. She wrote a book at her kitchen table, one page at a time. She has moved on to even bigger challenges, one action item at a time. Kathy reminds us of the power of completion, of the making and keeping of promises, of the starting and finishing of things. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.